It's absolutely an honor to be here in Vancouver with Tarun, who's not just an incredible journalist, but also an incredible writer and a dear friend. Tarun, just to start off, in the early 1980s, I remembered much of the Western countries used to look at India and they used to make fun of what was then called the Hindu rate of growth, which was always sort of between 4 and 5%. And nobody really looked at India as a serious emerging economic power. Yet roughly 10 or 15 years after that, in the early 1990s, much of that changed. And of course, today, India is being seen internationally as an incredible powerhouse. What made that change possible?
Well, I think largely, Sanjoy, it's been a function of several things. I think one of the things is the Anglo-Saxon view of the world. For the last 150 years, there's a kind of Anglo-Saxon view of the world that has dominated. And when the Anglo-Saxon view of the world says Africa is bad, then Africa becomes bad. And when the Anglo-Saxon world view says Africa is good, then Africa becomes good. And so for a long time, the Anglo-Saxon view of the world, which dominates world media, which is a particular way of looking at the world, decided that India was a bad story. And so India was a bad story. It didn't matter really what was happening inside India. The thing that we need to remember at all times, particularly those who are Indians or of Indian origin, and of course the rest of the world which now wants to understand India, is that the Indian story is very, very complex. People forget that when we became independent in 1947, we were embarking on what I deem as the single greatest creative act of the last 1,000 years. There has been no greater mass creative act than the idea of India. I mean, the fact that the founding fathers took a country of 350 million people, and it wasn't even a country to begin with, took a subcontinent of 350 million people who had been colonized brutally for 300 years, which was a feudal country for the last 1,000 years, and decided overnight to convert it into a modern, liberal, secular democracy is an extraordinary feat. It has no parallel in the history of man. Having embarked on that experiment, there was the business of laying down a foundation that could sustain a country of 350 million people, which was 90% illiterate and poor. It's become very fashionable in the last 15, 20 years to knock a man called Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm among those who believes that had not a man called Jawaharlal Nehru existed, we would not have the secular, democratic, liberal India that we have today. People forget what the founding fathers cobbled together, what they began to shape. It has been a very, very long ride. The efflorescence that we see today, the economic efflorescence, the creative efflorescence, the excitements of cinema and art and culture and yoga and cuisine, all these come from a basis that was laid 60 years ago by some of the most extraordinary men in the history of man. People like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar. I mean, there are scores of these men who even now when I read them, my hair stand on end because they were so extraordinary, both in intellect and in noble aspiration. The fact that the efflorescence came in the 90s has largely to do with the fact that you had a lot of ground to cover. You had nothing. There's a very important statistic I like to quote very often. When the British set foot in India and began to expand, and there were those two key battles, the Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar in 1957 and in 1757 and 1764, led by Robert Clive, and the British began to kind of lay the tentacles on the subcontinent. The share of India's GDP, of the world GDP, was 18.6%. 18.6% of the world's GDP came from India. And 1.8% was the share of Great Britain of the world's GDP. When the empire leaves India in 1947, India's share of the global GDP is down to 1.2%. And England's share is close to 19%. In those 250 years, it has actually just reversed itself. I mean, what the founding fathers are left with is an incredibly impoverished people, illiterate people, no manufacturing, no sources of any kind of easy growth. There's a railway system laid by the British, largely to transport their own economic and advance their own economic advantages. There is really nothing. And on this nothingness, on this great nothingness, these extraordinary men and women say, we will create a modern, democratic, secular republic. Why is India different from the entire post-colonial world? Why out of the 100 countries that have become independent in the last 70 years, is India alone so unique, despite having the size and problems it has? It all has to do with that founding vision. And that founding vision meant that you didn't run amok. The founding vision meant you held tight and you tried to lay the plinth bit by bit, stone by stone, so that an edifice could be raised that could actually stand. The fact that so many people in India today enjoy the most glorious liberties that are available in the West, it is no different in India than it is in Canada in terms of political freedoms, in terms of social freedoms. It's the same. The reason it's the same is because that plinth was laid with great care and great courage and great labor. So, but it wasn't something that suited the Anglo-Saxon view of the world in the 70s. They were quite happy to dub us as a country of snake charmers and elephants, and that was all right. I mean, that was what it was meant to be. But in the last 20 years, India has also become something else. It's become an incredible market for consumer goods for every manufacturer in the world. Having saturated their own markets, they look at this 1 billion and 200 million people, and for a moment, let's count out 800 million. They look at a potentially 200 million to 400 million middle class. We can put that to scale. Canada is 30 million. So even the Indian middle class, which is a fraction of the Indian total population, is reckoned at 250 million. That's 8 times Canada. So now you see the markets. And now, so the narrative changes. So it becomes a narrative about superpower India, shining India, booming India, a new India. Actually, it's not. It's the continuum of a story that began 100 years ago. And that story will have its moments of glory and will continue to have its moments of failure.
In 1947, Tarun, when the two countries were created, Pakistan on the 14th of August, India on the 15th of August, both, in a sense, as an experiment, and as you said, that much of the Western world wrote off India primarily because of the kind of democracy that it aspired to be. And it wrote it off because it also held still the second largest Muslim population in the world. Today, is India, in a sense, inclusive? Does it pay heed to its minority groups, to the Sikhs, to the Muslims, to the Christians who live there? Not necessarily in comparison to Pakistan, but in a sense, in an identity of India.
Well, there's a headline always in these things, and then there's the body copy. If you were to ask me what's the headline, I would say the headline is India is a great, inclusive, tolerant nation. If you were to ask me what's the body copy, I would say the body copy is it's a mess. It's a mess because you have to understand that when you deal with a population the size of India, 1 billion and 200 million people, which is driven across dozens of fault lines of language, fault lines of religion, fault lines of caste, fault lines of class, fault lines of ethnicity. I mean, there are so many different fault lines that crisscross India that it's a miracle that the country actually works and holds together. Is it still inclusive and tolerant? I think fundamentally it is, but that is something that has to be fought for every single day of our lives. I think that quality of inclusiveness that is India is constantly under assault. It is under assault by bigotry, and bigotry is not a uniquely Indian phenomenon. Bigotry is a global phenomenon. If there is a challenge to the future of man, it's bigotry, racial bigotry, language bigotry, class bigotry, the bigotry of all kinds. So that bigotry always simmers close to the surface everywhere. When you have the pressure cooker numbers that India has, when you have 1 billion and 200 people, my city alone, Delhi, where Sanjoy and I live, has 22 million people, and it's growing every single day. When you have that level of numbers, then that pressure cooker atmosphere creates new threats every single day. So there is the bigotry which is simmering at all times, but it has to be fought. And I think that particular fight has been going on since the foundation of India. Even when we were being debated into existence by these extraordinary men and women, there were two views of India. There was always a contesting view, and the contesting view was there was a majoritarian view. There was a Hindu right-wing view of India, which imagined that India should be a dominantly Hindu country, 85% Hindu, so it should be a Hindu nation, led and dominated by the metabolisms of being a Hindu. But this was something that was resisted by another school of thought that always deemed that India would only be a success if it became a great mosaic, a great melting pot, and a nation that protected its minorities with great zeal. Even today, 62 years later, that battle is on. 40 years later, that battle will still be on. These are battles of worldview. There are different worldviews. People like me belong to the Nehruvian worldview, who believe that the soul of India is fundamentally an inclusive soul. You know, my wife and I were I was telling them yesterday, my wife and I were at New Orleans just November last year for a conference called Rebooting America. I mean, I was the only Indian speaker apart from Sam Petroda there. And I was speaking on the second day. For the first 2 days, I heard speaker after American speaker talking about the American dream, because that was what seemed to be under assault because of the recession. And the American dream is the pursuit of money, happiness, and pleasure. That's the American dream. And when it was my turn to speak, I said, you know, in India, we don't have the Indian dream. We have the idea of India. And the idea of India is about tolerance, inclusiveness, and compassion. That's what was bequeathed to us as a founding vision by our founding fathers. We are an incredibly poor country. 500 million Indians live at sub-Saharan poverty levels. We have more poor people in India than the entire population of Africa. For us to forget that, for us to forget that in the headiness of the economic successes we've had is a great tragedy. So, I mean, as I said, these are things that we will have to struggle with every given day of our lives.
I'm going to get you to just hold on the poverty question for a second and just go back to the 1980s when you, and in fact, Geetan, and both of you were in the Punjab, and you were formidable journalists at that point of time, writing up stories about what was happening in the Punjab and the big Khalistan movement. You saw it close up. The battle that was finally won, that brought Punjab back from the brink, it was an incredible battle, and it was an incredible story of the inclusiveness of India. Because we are here in Vancouver, I was very keen for you to just share with us, why you thought that we were able to win that battle and bring Punjab back into the Indian fold as it is today, without any doubt.
Well, you know, I covered the Punjab movement, the secessionist movement in Punjab as a young reporter, 20 years old, and I met Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale when I was 20 years old in my probably second assignment of my life, and I met him at the Golden Temple, and I have to say that he was a very charismatic figure, but he spoke utter nonsense, you know. I spent 2 hours with him. He was very charismatic, but he didn't speak any sense at all. There will, as I said earlier, there will always be forces of bigotry at work in India. And they will always find a certain amount of traction. There are going to be disaffected people. There are going to be unhappy people. And it will be always possible to stoke up people's unhappinesses into something more problematic. Even as I speak today, and so I'll come back to the Punjab question, even as I speak today, there is trouble in J&K, in Kashmir, which has been going on for the last 60 years. The Northeast is always in trouble. There is virtually an Indian army of occupation all over the Northeast, holding down trouble against by various secessionist groups. 30% of India's districts, at the very heart of India, are witnessing what we call Naxalite violence, Maoist insurgencies, Maoist violence, which has been deemed by the Prime Minister many years ago as the greatest threat facing India. So at any given point, the idea of India is under assault. The strength somewhere, and that applies to Punjab also, is again and again I keep coming back to it, it's the founding principles of India. It's the fact that fundamentally you remain a democracy and you create enough steam rooms to let the pressure out, you know. And so it becomes possible for that pressure to be let out every now and then, you know. But the fact that you remain in trouble goes without saying. In the case of Punjab, there was a very peculiar ratcheting up of disaffection. And it was very curious for a lot of outsiders. And I'm a Punjabi myself, so I speak as someone who's part of the same group. There was a ratcheting up of these disaffections, a lot from overseas and a lot from within. And it was very curious for a lot of observers because clearly the Punjabi and the Sikh is not someone who is either an unaffluent or an unenterprising individual. You know, in fact, when you look at India, you see the Sikhs and the Punjabis as one of the most prosperous and energetic groups, not just in India, but across the world. That's one of the hallmarks of Punjabis, that wherever they go, they create entrepreneurial energy and people energy around themselves. So, I mean, it was very, very paradoxical that it was the Sikhs and the Punjabis who were feeling disaffected to the extent they were. And clearly, that particular story did not have enough legs. It damaged us for a short while. It tore up the fabric in Punjab for a short while. But at the end of the day, I'll tell you what is the greatest sign that it did not have legs is the fact that in the 8 or 9 years that the Punjab secessionist movement was at its peak, there is not a single case, there is not one incident of any Sikh Hindu rioting anywhere in the Punjab. Not one. And that should give us an idea of how deeply embedded the Sikh is in the fabric of India, how deeply embedded he is in the culture of India. And the fact that what was happening was something that was almost artificial, something that was being provoked and invoked, but was not visceral to any of the problems that existed in the Punjab. And in good time, because it didn't have legs, it ran its course. And it moved on. But before it did some terrible things. It did create a momentary schism, and it did something which is, in my point, the lowest nadir in the history of modern India. It resulted in the anti-Sikh riots of 1984, which were a terrible, terrible moment, only to be then equaled in the dastardliness by the Gujarat killings of 2002.
Tarun, again, staying with the whole question of poverty, I remember 20 years ago shooting out in the desert, 25 years ago, shooting out in the desert near Bikaner. And Bikaner is in Rajasthan, it's in the desert. And we were shooting in a village which had no water, no recourse to electricity, no roads. And, you leave the road 5 kilometers and you don't see anything. 13 or 14 years ago, India brought about a reservation in the panchayati system for women, where 1/3 of the seats were reserved for women politicians. And initially, men put up their wives, their mothers, their sisters, etc. In the second round, that changed slightly. And when we went back, we saw that what had happened is that the woman, when she came to power in these villages, the first thing she did was say, hey, I want to bring water to my village. So she dug a well, or she got running water, or whatever. The second thing she said is, I have to walk, when I give birth, I don't have any health facilities. So she brought a PHC, or a primary health center, to her village. And the third thing she did is bring a little school, and she drove that as the primary thing. That, to a large extent, has been driving growth bottom up. Have there been other changes in the Indian politics to be, or is there anything that can speed up this process? We are still, as you said, 600 million people who are under the poverty line. Do you see the government and its people being able to speed up this process like this, in this particular way, through legislation?
More women running things, it's the answer. No, I mean it. I mean it. I mean, it's clearly, the virtues of empathy and tolerance that women bring to anything far exceed the testosteronic sort of, exertions of men. So, that will make a difference. I think it's going to be a process, Sanjoy. I think lots of things will go right and lots of things will go wrong. And I'll tell you, I would have been far more stringent 10 years ago. But the more I get embedded in the understanding of the running of the country, of the politics of the country, of the layers of the country, the more I realize what an enormous task it is for anyone to bring change. Because at every step, there is not only just the traffic lights of corruption, but there are the traffic lights of tradition. For example, in Haryana, we've been facing this problem of the khap panchayats, where the khap panchayats are village panchayats that have been virtually adjudicating life and death sentences in the villages. And they refuse to, and they've actually been ganging up to stand up against the formal legal courts. So there is the traffic light of tradition, there's the traffic light of orthodoxy, there's traffic light of illiteracy. There are all these kind of traffic lights against which people struggle. What legislation or policy may sound good for one community may not sound right to another community. We fight this kind of stuff on a daily basis. As I always say, I started off in journalism with great disrespect of politicians. That disrespect grew to utter contempt and dismay. Today, I live in utter awe and respect of politicians. When I look at the Indian politician and I see how much he manages to master and control on any given day, I'm amazed. Because the contesting pressures are so many. What will bring change, I think one of our failures has been universal education. I think what will bring dramatic acceleration to change in India is finally literacy and education. I think for some reason we just missed that step in the early decades of India's growth as a democracy. I think a lot more had to be poured into primary education and universal education in India. It didn't happen. Even today, almost 50% of India is illiterate. I mean, that's unforgivable 60 years later, because education changes everything. It makes you aware of your rights. It makes you aware of of the better life. It makes you aware of, the shape and nature of the world and your own place in it. I mean, all these things come onto you through education, and that remains denied to more than 50% of India's people today. Even the literacy counts are dubious literacy counts. Your literacy counted on the basis of being able to write the alphabet or sign. That's not just good enough. So I think education would be the real big changer. I think the other piece, which concerns me personally as a journalist, which has been a little dysfunctional over the last 20, 30 years, and which could make a huge change in altering the narrative, the modern narrative of India, is the engagement of the elite. The elite in India, for some reason, has turned its back on the rest of India. And that's a disaster, because the irony here and the tragedy, of course, is that the idea of India and India itself were created by the elite. It was an extraordinary elite that shaped the idea of India. Mahatma Gandhi went to Lincoln's Inn in London. Nehru went to Harrow and Cambridge. Ambedkar went to Columbia University in New York. I mean, and all of them turned their back and dedicated themselves to the greater good. So there was a clear sense of the greater good. That sense of the greater good, I feel, has been lost by the elite in India. The elite in India has become obsessed with its own interests, with its own indulgences, and would idly wish away the rest of the country. So every time the elite agitates for something to change in the national narrative, it only agitates for things that would suit itself. That quality of selfishness in an elite is dangerous. There is no civilization in the history of mankind that has not been shaped by its elite. The Greek, the Roman, the ancient Hindu, the Chinese, all civilizations are given their true purpose and color by the elite. If the elite is extraordinary, the civilization becomes extraordinary. My problem, and what we try and do with our journalism is to try and constantly provoke the elite into becoming a more illuminated and purposeful elite. And I think that's the missing synapse. So there's the education, as I said, at the mass level, and then there's this kind of disengagement of the elite. I think if the elite actually begins to get more and more engaged, I think the speed of change will accelerate dramatically.
What about the role of, say, civil society groups? I mean, a number of stories that Tehelka, for example, have done has actually propelled civil society to act. News media has driven that. Similarly, here recently in Vancouver, the civil society group also was able to stymie a big government project. Do you feel that given the vastness of India and the disparate forces that influence different groups, does civil society have that role? Can that become extra constitutional? Is there a role for that?
Yeah, there's always a fear of that. Civil society is a potent force in any free society. What is civil society? It's hyper citizens. It's citizens who or meta citizens or hyper citizens, citizens who take it upon themselves to challenge governance or change governance. There is the electoral process, which in a sense is the only true legitimate process in a democracy. The most legitimate public figure in any democracy is the elected representative. I mean, you can say, of any elected representative, you can say he's stupider than me, he's uglier than me, he's morally third rate. But you can never say he's less legitimate than me. The elected representative is always the most legitimate person in the public landscape. And this has been one of my contesting issues with the civil society movement going on in India right now with the Lokpal bill. I mean, all the men leading that Lokpal bill agitation, Prashant Bhushan, Anna Hazare, Arun Kejriwal, they're all personal friends of mine. But I have not thrown in my hat with them because I believe that structurally what they're trying to push for is very dangerous. Structurally, in a democracy, you have to respect the primacy of parliament and elected leaders. You cannot begin to say that we will legislate without being elected. You can recommend, you can suggest, but you can't go beyond that. And in that sense, the schism in the civil society movement in India itself, with absolutely outstanding public warriors like Aruna Roy, etc., who have also not participated, has been along the same lines. Aruna Roy's position has been more or less the same, that what we can demand is that the government listen to our suggestions. What we cannot do is we cannot go hold a gun to its head, because that's a dangerous precedent. Because that means anybody who can gather 20,000 people, which means there are 10 million people in India who can gather 20,000 people behind them, can actually hold a gun to the head of a government and say, this is how it should be. It's dangerous structurally. That's, we want to fight corruption, we want a positive change, but you can't knock the bottom out of the whole edifice, and you can't knock the validity of the Constitution, which is one of the greatest public documents in the world. The Indian Constitution was written, debated by absolutely brilliant men and women, and it's a great document. At the worst times, it's the Constitution that has protected us from falling off the map. We have to hold on to that Constitution. We have to protect that Constitution. We can't become party for momentary gains, for short-term gains, to actually sinking the Constitution. So the civil society, yes, it does have a role. I think its role is as a pressure group. Its role is as an advisory group. Its role is as a lightning rod for important ideas. But I don't think its role is to hold a gun to the head of elected representatives, because that's a dangerous precedent. I don't think its role is to go on fast unto deaths and blackmail governments into passing laws which have not been passed in a legitimate way. I think that's dangerous, because that opens up the can of worms for blackmail from any source and every source.
Tarun, today much of the international business community, as their areas of revenue dry up in the West, are looking to India to invest. And there's some apprehension, because they tend to say, India, China, what should we do? They know that if they go to China, they're able to work with a particular group of people, invest, but have no recourse to legal justice if it comes to that. In India, there's always this fear of the nexus between the politician, the bureaucrats, the media, and the whole thing of power, money, and politics. And that sort of gives them a sense of fear of not knowing what to do and how to cope with it. I mean, is this nexus a real nexus? Is it a problem? How do people circumvent that problem? How do they address that problem?
Well, these are sort of lots of different questions. Let's deal with the China-India thing that you mentioned. I always find it extremely amusing that the same Anglo-Saxon view of the world that declares liberty to be the first principle of its own functioning promptly sheds that principle when it comes to doing business and making money. So the moment it's about making money, you don't care where you make money, But otherwise, in your own societies, it's the first principle of the good life, liberty. So I mean, that's the China thing. So you want to do work in China because it's made easy for you and make money easily? I mean, be my guest. I mean, you want to come to India? We can't set up the party for you. I'm sorry to sound like a kind of curmudgeonly Indian, but at the end of the day, it's not the Indian government's responsibility to set up a money-making party for the rest of the world. The Indian government's problem is to run a damn country that begins to alleviate the miseries of its own poor people. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and I would say that to everybody, and I have said that to everybody in power from the Prime Minister down, that those are our concerns. Our concerns are not that whether we are a great investment climate or not. Our concerns are, can we feed our children? Can we clothe our children? Can we send our children to school? And the world, I assure you, will come to India. The world will come to India because there's money to be made in India. And they will come and make money on India's terms. And that's okay. And that's how it should be. For hundreds of years, the Western world has come and made money in India on their terms. Now they'll come and make money on India's terms. I'm not among those who panics each time they start issuing press releases and notices that investment has dipped by 2% or 6%, or so-and-so fund has halved its commitment to India. I don't worry about that at all, because I know there is money to be made in India. There are 1 billion people, 1 billion consumers, 1 billion units that can be fed, clothed, sold things to. The world will come to India. And let the world come on India's terms. That's okay. I don't think we should worry about that at all. I think more importantly, when we talk about entrepreneurship, and I'm a great admirer of entrepreneurship, I think the world is shaped by entrepreneurial energy. Everything in the world that we enjoy, everything in the world that exists because someone somewhere dreamt it up. somewhere some entrepreneur dreamt it up and made it possible. So I personally am a great admirer of entrepreneurial energy. I believe in entrepreneurial energy. But at the same time, you know, when people come to India now, I just feel, and this includes Indian businessmen doing business in India, I think what has to become axiomatic is not what you give back to society, what people who make money give back to society. What has to become axiomatic is how does business make money from society? So I mean, the prevailing discourse has been a discourse of CSR, you know, corporate social responsibility. How do we give back to society having made money from society? I think part of the discourse will soon have to become how does business make money from society? Because I can tell you in India, there are 100 different battles going on these issues. There is the issue of mining. There is the issue of land. These are areas where there are vast amounts of money to be made, but these are also issues that step on the rights of a lot of common and ordinary people. We've seen a huge change in Bengal just now. The left front government, the CPM government, the communist government, for the first time in 34 years has lost power. And the reason it lost power was simply because of one misconceived pushing of a sudden project by the Tatars in Singur and Nandigram, a car project in which they tried to forcibly take land from villagers. And on that one issue, which became a watershed issue in the state, it's lost power, you know. So I'm saying the people in India now will fight these things. So it makes more and more sense to create a more enlightened business climate and to insist that those who come to do business in India recognize that they're entering a complex space, and it's not going to be done simply for them. But there is money to be made, and people will come. Where the Indian government is concerned, I think I would advise against obsessing about the nature and quality of the investment. I think it'll come. I think what they really need to worry about is sorting out their own governance issues. I mean, they need to sort the courts, they need to sort the police system, they need to sort the land system. I mean, these are the great challenges that India faces for itself.
You know, there's a large number of Indians who left its shores in the 50s and 60s and came out to places like Canada and UK and America and settled down and have become very, very successful. In India itself, you know, we have as we know, we have a concept called jugaad. So if, you know, the spacecraft is not going up, somebody runs, ties two wires together and sends it up. In America, I mean, an equivalent would be they'd have a committee, they'll study what happened to the wire, they'll have a whole, you know, 3-month inquiry system, and the spacecraft will sit. So jugaad as an economic sort of principle has perhaps been what the diaspora has really taken on. What's made them so successful in your thinking?
I think the Indian entrepreneur is formidable. I mean, for the last 10 years, I've laughed with all my white businessmen friends saying, you have no idea what's going to hit you when the Indian guys start going abroad, which has begun to happen. You know, and part of this entrepreneurial energy in a very strange way, and I'm going to make a long shot at trying to make a synapse, draws from, I think, Hinduism. You know, Hinduism is a very complex religion. Hinduism is also, in many senses, the most interesting religion in the world. And a lot of the DNA, the shape and nature of what Indians are, comes from the very foundational nature of Hinduism. And the key to Hinduism is that at its heart, it's a very morally slippery religion. You know, and that is both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. At its heart, Hinduism is not a prescriptive religion. It doesn't tell you what's right or wrong. It's astonishing and incredibly wise and mature, and also dangerously foolish in the way that it leaves all volition to the individual. I mean, the core phrase, of course, is Tattvamasi, thou art that. So Hinduism never prescribes. Hinduism actually leaves it to the individual to decide at all points what is right or wrong. There are two core concepts in Hinduism, karma and dharma. Karma is a simple concept. You all understand that. It's a cool word around the world, you know, karma. So everybody understands karma. And karma really literally means action, you know, and the fruits of action, the results of action. But the far more enigmatic and mesmeric word is dharma. There is no explanation, no exact description of what dharma means in any scripture in India. None of the scriptures from antiquity tell you what dharma actually means. The closest that you can come to is that dharma means right conduct. But right conduct as seen by the individual. So the assumption of dharma is that every individual knows in him or herself what is right conduct. What is the right conduct at any given point of time? And that right conduct changes from context to context. So if you read what I deem to be the greatest novel in the history of man, the Mahabharata, the idea of dharma is riddled through the entire Mahabharata. And every time, the greatest figures, Bhishma, Arjuna, Krishna, Yudhishthira, Bhima, Duryodhana, I mean, the greatest individuals who people that epic come and grapple with the idea of dharma. And each one is trying to understand what dharma is, what is right conduct. But it's never explained what is right conduct. Unlike both Christianity and Islam, which are very largely prescriptive religions, where the code is clear. You know, if you're a Jew, it's even clearer. So it's pretty clear that this is on, this is not on, this is on, this is not on. Hindus are not. So now let me make the leap of the imagination to Hindus as businessmen. So every businessman, every Hindu is a businessman, is pretty much free to do exactly what he wants. And I promise you, you'll see that as you go along, and those of you who deal with them, their ability to be morally slippery. And I have incredible friends who are businessmen, and I know how they work. They're astonishing. So it's almost creative. So be benign about it. They're very creative, you know. So a lot of the entrepreneurial energy that you will see on behalf of Hindus across the world and Indians across the world, in some sense, derives from the deep kind of civilizational DNA that we possess. And that civilizational DNA, let me tell you, marks the subcontinent. It doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Hindu. You're finally marked by that kind of civilizational DNA that Hinduism produces. I myself, let me just proclaim, I'm an agnostic. You know, I used to be an atheist, but I've slowly sort of matured to become an agnostic. But philosophically, I've always been very proud to say that I'm a Hindu. I'm fascinated by the incredible wisdom of all the abstract concepts that the ancients dreamt up and wrote down. I mean, the old treatises are extraordinary in the maturity and their breadth. I mean, it's a pity that people like me who come from the privileged elite class of India and were largely brought up in a very anglicized upbringing were pretty much denied a very clear interface with our own heritage. I mean, I almost hold it against the system. I hold it against my parents. And people like me have had to go back and discover it on our own. Find that deep heritage. Find that deep learning. That is our true inheritance. It's been denied to us because we became Macaulay's children. You know, so we had to be English. We had to read Wordsworth. We had to read Shakespeare, which is all great. I love Shakespeare. I think he's the greatest writer who probably ever lived. But the truth is that it was narrowed for us. Our incredible heritage. Nobody taught us Hindustani classical music. Nobody told us that we had the most glorious tradition in miniature painting 600 years ago, 400 years ago. I mean, so there was this incredible history of music, astronomy, science, sex. I mean, we were the champions of sex in the world. I mean, nobody could do it in as many ways as we could do it, you know? But all of this was denied to us by the slightly Victorian, you know, upbringing that was bequeathed to us. So we had to go back and learn a lot of this stuff, and that's a pity. I mean, what we've gained from the Occident is fantastic, but some of what we've lost of the great Oriental inheritance of ours is tragic.
Before I get you to lead the audience with some particularly good sexual positions, let me ask you one last question and then open it up. The role of journalism, you know, I just read, in fact, yesterday when the new statistics have come out, and in India's print journalism or print publications grew at 33%, and the rest of the world, especially in the Western world, went from -2 to about 3%, with a number of publications closing down. And I think it's especially at threat in North America and in parts of Europe. And yet we know that in India, that's not necessarily all good news, because much of journalism outside of perhaps voices like Tehelka, which talk about, you know, social issues of the other half of India, which is not heard. There is a moral problem today where it comes to journalism, and then again the nexus, and we've seen that with, I mean, much publicized in all the television programs of late with Rupert Murdoch's story. How is that going to play out? How do you see that nexus sort of working its way into the Indian story? I mean, not necessarily Rupert Murdoch, but also, is your comment on the Rupert Murdoch kind of sting operations, etc., What's the comment that you have on that?
No, let's start with Rupert Murdoch, because it's always a good place to start. You know, personally, I think it's sordid. I mean, the revelations that have come out of the news of the world and the kind of journalism they were practicing, a journalism of paying policemen, paying investigators, hacking into accounts, I think it's incredibly sordid. And I think it's just fattened societies that kind of end up devoting the priority of their resources to this kind of voyeuristic, trivial journalism. I think in India, it would have no purchase, or it should not have any purchase. I don't think this is the kind of journalism that should be practiced or ought to be practiced in India. The Indian media story is a booming story. It's a story that in the last 15 years has just gone exponentially. The newspapers are growing. We have more live news television channels than any other country in the world. Overall, I think we've just crossed or come close to 500 television channels in India. There are magazines, there are websites. It's an exponentially growing story, but it has to be seen in the background of where it begins from. And the reason it's growing, whereas everywhere else in the world, for example, let's take newspapers, the linchpin of media. The newspapers in India are growing because the hinterland of potential readers is still vast. There are still 800-900 million people who haven't even come into their first reading of newspapers. So there is a large hinterland that has to be worked through. In other markets in the world, the readerships are saturated. The young readers are moving into the new media, onto the web, and the old are dying as they should. But in India, you have this unbelievable hinterland that is still beginning to just come into literacy and the reading of newspapers. They are a leap away from the world of the web. They watch television and they start reading newspapers. And that's the reason you're seeing these kind of growth figures. And I think they will go on for a long time. And that brings me back to what I said earlier, that there is money to be made in India, there is growth to be seen in India, and people will come and do it on India's terms. The question of what is the true quality of Indian media, now that's a question that can be said of all free societies in the world. What is the quality of American media? What's the quality of British media? British we've seen, it's crap. But what's the quality of media in other worlds? It's both a bit of good and bad. So there's lots of bad and third-rate media in India, and there's a lot of excellent media. I'll tell you what works in favor of the Indian media is its plurality. Because there's so much and it's growing, it tends to cancel out each other's biases and failings. So of course there are, so if there is a set of newspapers or channels that is aligned to a particular party, there'll be others that are totally opposed to that. So by this kind of multiplicity, biases get cancelled out. So there isn't a monopoly, and that's what we should fear if it ever comes to be, that there is a monopoly. And because we're also multilingual in the craziest sense, there are Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, and Malayalam papers that sell in millions, more than English. Because we are so multilingual, that's again a great safety valve. That means that it's not possible for any government or any businessman to actually buy or control all of Indian media. There's just too much and it's too varied. And that becomes a safety wall. Much of it may be bad, but in its totality, in its entirety, it becomes a good thing. So individually, there may be great failings in media, but because it's as much as it is, it ends up becoming a force of basic good.